Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's Talk Consciousness. I am your hostess, Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good today. Thanks for asking. And we want to thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Today on The Voice of Yoga, we will talk about celebrating World Vegetarian Day as one of many lifestyle choices to promote union with the divine. Kriya Yoga, as a spiritual science, recommends a diet that consists of only foods that get their nourishment from the sun. Listen as we discuss the effects of food on the human mind-body complex and the causal spiritual body. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat." That's in Genesis 1:29 in the King James Version. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance. Get the light in your soul and live out from the perfection of being. Swami, I have some notes from wincalendar.com and worldvegetarianday.org. Some facts about vegetarianism. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, plants produce more than 10 times the amount of protein that can be produced per acre by animals. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well, humans consume more than 80 billion animals yearly. And this I find very interesting too, especially those people who are into the conservation of the earth. It takes 150 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of wheat. To produce 1 pound of meat, more than 4,000 gallons of water are needed. And I think some of the other environmental factors that would need to be taken in consideration to promote vegetarianism is the fact that it does decrease greenhouse gases that accelerate global warming, and also it will also help the ever-expanding environmental pollution of animal agriculture. So, Swami, there are some facts about why we should become vegetarians, but what does this have to do with Kriya Yoga?
Yeah, when we're looking at material laws and all of the physical reasons, it is one way of understanding this. But when you're dealing with a spiritual science like Kriya Yoga, that you have very different goals and objectives, that it's really about not really so much about living longer or looking younger or turning all the bad things in life back into good. It's really about transcending and identifying with the simple fact that we are eternal spiritual beings. But in the framework of making this transformation, making this change of identity from material values and material means to spiritual values and spiritual law, it's a process, it's an unfolding. And in Kriya Yoga, the prescription for food is that your primary source of nourishment comes from foods that get their nourishment from the sun. And then your secondary source of nourishment would be to eat animals that get their nourishment from foods that get their nourishment from the sun. And the third choice would be to eat animals that eat other animals. I think what we're really trying to get at here is, when is something a rule and a law of conduct, and when is it your natural state of being? We really want to try and see that there are goals and objectives here, that we are trying to move from being under material law, and we are trying to identify with this spiritual sense of selfhood. And our relationship to all of our lifestyle functions, I think, has an effect on us because it changes how we think, how we feel, and how we perform. That on a physical level, there is relativity that has to be taken into consideration here.
Well, I think it's very interesting to think about, do we refrain from eating animals because of a fear of conduct? And then there's the argument that people will say, well, I have to eat meat because of my blood type, or whatever excuse that they want to give. So I think that's a really interesting topic to try to contemplate.
Yeah, because a lot of us are accustomed to living out from rules and regulations and laws and the relativity of everything. But you have to realize that when you're living out from relativity, you're living under the law of karma, which is material law. And it's what we're putting out is what we're getting back. If that's your goal, all you really are looking to do to satisfy whatever your personal desire or interest is out of what you want to get out of life, if you're just happy in turning bad things into good, then you can comply to all of these different laws and rules, and everything will outpicture and externalize based on whatever you believe in. But when you're dealing with your goal to be spiritual, when you have a goal to transcend the law of karma, to get out of the cycle of death and rebirth, then you're going to have to comply to a stricter and a more scientific approach than just belief. In this aspect, what we're really trying to see is, like we had said, when is something a rule and a law of conduct, and when is it your natural state of being? Because to be spiritual really means that you have to identify with your divine nature. We can't be both human and divine at the same time. And doesn't it make sense that what foods are ingested should comply with the characteristics of our nature? And so if we are going to accept our spiritual sense of selfhood, and we are going to align with our divine nature, then we want to live out of divine law. We want to live out from characteristics that would comply with the divine nature. One of the commandments is, thou shalt not kill. I really meditate on this quite a bit, because can we eat flesh and still sow to the spirit? When does the like attracts like come into play? And it has been said that we are what we eat. And so when you're trying to renounce the world and you're trying to move beyond the testimony of your five sense mind, it just makes perfect sense to me that you are really going to have to change how you nurture yourself. In the framework of this process, the first order of business is that we have to put spirit in its rightful position as a source of nourishment. And spirit is your primary, your number one life-sustaining force. And when we do that, then food moves out of that position of importance. And we never use food to validate ourselves or to reward ourselves. And we never eat emotionally. That food becomes more of a conscious choice. But what we're using to validate ourselves is spirit. And spirit is invisible and it's intangible. And of anything that we ingest, it is the only thing that is frequency free. It has no vibration. And when you are ingesting and sustaining yourself on the presence of spirit, you're at a very different frequency than if, say, for example, you use food to validate yourself, period. But then even in relation to the foods that we eat, flesh has a very different frequency than vegetables. And so sometimes as you're starting to make this gradual transition of moving from material means and even mental means to a higher, even spiritual sense of self, that the relativity does start to play an important role. Because if you have a body that is craving food, then it really interferes with your ability to have sensitivity and awareness for this very subtle source of sustenance.
I think there's a fine line between eating because we have to eat, we need to have so many calories, and then what we eat, what we choose to eat. And like you said, it's all choices. If you decide that you want to partake in eating of the vegetables, then you're going to receive that kind of energy from that food. And I think, going to the meat department in a grocery store and picking up some meat, there can't be the same kind of energy found in that than you can find in the vegetables.
Right. And by the same token, too, I mean, there are a lot of vegans and vegetarians who have what I consider to be unhealthy diets because of all the amounts of sugar that they eat and a lot of the processed foods that they eat that may not contain animal products at all or any kind of meat. But by the same token, they eat a lot of what I would consider to be processed foods. And it could be a very unhealthy diet. And a lot of it has to do with, well, what am I trying to do? What are my goals and objectives? I mean, some people just don't eat meat because they just don't like to harm anything. And then there are other people that have different goals and objectives. Some people eat because they think that their health is dependent upon the food that they eat. And so, again, a lot of it is going to come down to what are my beliefs. Now, in this framework of a spiritual science, you have to understand that your health does not come from what you are eating. It doesn't come from anything external. Your health comes from your identity with the divine law, which is health itself.
So I'd like to get your thoughts about something. So I have throughout the years, I would eat certain vegetables so I could, or fruits so I could gain something from them. And then I would stop eating a certain vegetable because I found out, well, you shouldn't eat nightshade vegetables because they can do this to your body. So then I was avoiding certain kinds of foods. And so I'd like to get back to that about belief in foods. Do we take this scientific information about these foods and believe them, or do we just eat whatever we want? Because really, in God's world, nothing can really harm us.
Yeah, again, I totally get what you're saying, because there are so many different laws and rules that have come down as a result of our Western scientific approach to life. Do you use maybe basic food combination considerations in what you're doing, or do you let go of all of that? It's a very delicate decision that we have to make here, because how far do you go with it? I mean, if you say that God is everywhere and in everything, it doesn't matter what you eat. You should be able to eat paint. And there are some people that are at that level of consciousness that that's exactly what they can do, because what they see is God everywhere and in everything. But if we are still working towards that level of a consciousness, then we have to really stay within the limits of your level of understanding of how things are playing out. If, say, for example, you can eat anything and still maintain your, what I would consider to be spiritual identity, not just pretending to do it, because there are some really important guidelines that we can use to determine, am I living my life according to divine law, or am I living my life according to karmic law and just seemingly being more successful? And in the framework of understanding ourselves, I think it's important to know what we are doing and what is your true level of consciousness.
Well, I think this is a good place to pause to hear a word from our sponsors. So listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Theory 2 is a unique and revolutionary practice and forum designed to facilitate the growth process in human development. Apotheosis is a real experience and has an evidence procedure. You cannot lead someone to permanent change by doing for them what they must do themselves. Personal accountability and responsibility are the foundation of Kriya Yoga Theory 2. You must be engaged and devoted. Prana power brings virtue to overcome fear, wisdom to overcome ignorance, purpose to overcome selfishness, enthusiasm to overcome laziness. Kriya Yoga is a path of action, knowledge, and devotion. These sessions are a celestial positioning system to guide the individual into union with the divine. For more information or to sign up for your next session online, go to www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, I'd like to get back to some of those facts that we had mentioned earlier. So, if everybody can become vegetarian, have a vegetarian diet, like I said earlier, we can save animals from suffering factory farm conditions. We can conserve vital limited freshwater, topsoil, and other precious resources. We also can preserve irreplaceable ecosystems such as the rainforests and wildlife habitats. We can decrease the greenhouse gases that are accelerating global warming. We can mitigate the ever-expanding environmental pollution of animal agriculture. So all of these things are like really good reasons for us to want to become vegetarians. But I guess my concerns is that there's a lot of government control as well as to how much food is to be grown, how much crops can be harvested. And we know now that there's a lot of those crops and foods are feeding the animals and not necessarily just the humans. So now we've interfered with the natural cycle of things. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to the simple fact that the human race in general has really lost touch with its spiritual roots, with its divine nature. And so you can start to see the trickle-down effect that this, for a lack of a better word, this ignorance has upon everything, the relativity of everything. Because if the human was living according to its divine nature, and it was under the divine law of harmony, the vegetarian diet would be something that would be natural for the human. We would comply with a lot of the rules and regulations because we need laws to uphold the conduct that we do naturally when we're a human in our divine nature. But what's happening or what's missing is that we are not growing psychologically and spiritually. We're not living out from the perfection of being. We're living out from our five sense mind, and for the most part, we're controlled by fear. And we're under the law of karma. And so how we think is what we become. And when we're living out from our human identity and seeing ourselves as separate entities, our exchange of energy with our environment is we're drawing off of it. But once we have initiated a progressive cycle and we start to grow, and the only way that we can do that is with this union with the divine. When all of a sudden we give up a personal sense of self and we start to align with an impersonal sense of spiritual selfhood, then everything starts to come back into play because you're living under divine law. And divine law is perfect. And it has the template for perfect creation. And it's backed by the principle. It's backed by the one power of this universe. Most of us, we're trying to fix everything by making human rules when, in fact, I think we would have a much better chance if we understood how to live our lives spiritually and how to live out from divine law and get away from the belief in two powers, the belief in duality.
You just reminded me of the story about the teacher who brings the student down to the water and dunks his head in the water, and he's spluttering, and he can't take a breath because his head's underwater, and the teacher lifts him up and says, when you want God as much as you want air, that's when you can realize your spirituality. And so that just made me think of, if you want that candy bar or that hamburger more than you want that relationship with your divinity, that really tells us that we have to really change our order of things that are important to us.
Right. And that's where Kriya Yoga begins. It starts with this union with the individual, with the divine, and you change your values. And you start to move away from things that don't have the same degree of importance. This concept of putting God first, and what does that look like when I'm doing it? Because if you do not desire God, if you do not have for lack of a better word, an addiction for God, then you have an addiction for something else. And that's where everything starts to fall apart. Because there's only one God. And if it's not in its rightful position in your value system as number one, and it can't just be academic. You can't just say, well, I put God first, now give me a cigarette. You have to not only know it, do it, but you have to be spiritual. And when we have achieved that level of understanding, when we love God with our heart, our soul, and our mind, then we no longer have to figure anything out. We no longer have to think humanly, because the raiment of our mind will then be clothed with divine ideas, and spirit will basically live us. And when we are living under spiritual law, we will be in perfect harmony with the balance of nature. And I think what we'll find is that under this rulership, that we will be of a conscious vegan choice about the foods that you're going to eat, because you will be thinking right. And then, of course, you will be breathing right. You will keep yourself hydrated. And then the foods that you eat will be of a divine nature, that the foods that you eat will give you maximum nourishment. And you will not be able to eat the things that produce cravings and disturbances and things that will interfere with this relationship with the divine. To have this primary relationship with the divine where you put God first, where you prey on the presence of the divine. And when I say pray, I really mean P-R-E-Y, that becomes your primary source of sustenance. but it's your number one go-to for any form of validation or reward that we are looking for, because it is your source of joy.
Yeah, very interesting. I agree. I think we put a lot of emphasis on food where it really doesn't need to be there. And I think we, especially in the Western civilizations, I think we really eat more than we really need to. I think if we spent more time maybe praying, Prey, instead of focusing on what we're going to have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I think there could really be some major shifts in our global world consciousness.
Yeah, and I really like what it says in Revelations about the whole symbolism of the marriage supper of the Lamb, in which the marriage supper, we feast upon the Word of God, that the Word becomes flesh, that how we think is what we become. And when we're thinking with God, we really start to externalize and outpicture the perfection of being. We start to live in a world that resembles the Garden of Eden, which was where everything started.
Well, I was hoping, Swami, that you could maybe clarify some points for me. Earlier you had mentioned about that we can't sow to the flesh and sow to the spirit. And then you said that we must renounce the flesh before we have attention for spirit. Can you explain that in a little bit more detail? What does it mean to sow to the flesh, and what does it mean to sow to the spirit?
Yeah, it's what we draw off of. It's really what we desire. And that really kind of plugs us into what we always call the physics of spirituality, that like attracts like. And if we are attached to things visible and tangible, that would be what I would consider to be sowing to the flesh. If we are attached to things invisible but tangible, I think it would be almost the equivalent of sowing to the flesh, because you're still drawing from duality. Matter and mind are two sides of the same coin. And so what we're trying to do, though, is we're trying to separate from our attachment to duality, things visible and tangible or things invisible and tangible, and we are trying to reconnect or join with spirit. And when I say this, to sow to the spirit, it's not so much like you're going to unplug from this outlet and put it in that outlet. It's more of a sense of we do this in consciousness because we are already spiritual. We are already under divine law, but we don't have awareness of it. And that's a key thing, because what we hold in our field of awareness is what we activate. That's why how we think is what we become. And this whole concept of sowing to the spirit, but you can't sow to the spirit and to the flesh. That's what we have to make the choice. And when we finally make the decision that we want to sow to the spirit, you have to draw it from something that produces no frequency. It has absolutely no transmission in your five sense mind. And that's when all of a sudden you desire this void or this nothing, that's when you are now under spiritual law.
Well, great. Thanks for that explanation. Well, this is time we need to start closing down our program for today. So listeners, be sure to visit the websites, www.ipdtransform.com. Listed on that homepage, you'll see a section called Swami Says Recent Posts, and you'll see this show listed there as well as some others that you can click on to listen to the shows in their entirety. Be sure to listen also to our Facebook Live weekly episodes we do every Wednesday at 5 p.m. So, Swami, do you have any other final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to enjoy their vegan and vegetarian meals and try and keep them as in alignment with divine law as they possibly can. And with that, I'll wish everybody a good day. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.